Hey guys, I set myself the challenge of trying to make a video that would explain why I object to vegan abolitionism in a way that would be approachable and easy to understand for vegans who had never seen my channel before, who had never seen any of my prior videos talking about this topic and closely related topics. But I will say, as a preface to this discussion, that this is something I've addressed before. It's something that's been an important part of my life for years. And if you've been seriously engaged in vegan politics, philosophy, and political philosophy in the last 10 years, you've probably been watching sort of the rise and fall of abolitionism as a paradigm within the movement. I think there's no doubt that in the last decade, abolitionism has been the most influential idea, certainly within American English-speaking veganism. I can't say, obviously, Japan, Germany, there are other cultures that have very different notions. And the American origins of abolitionism are obvious to me all the time. I'm Canadian, but obviously it's easy for me to understand English in an American accent. The concept of abolitionism itself seems to appeal to a notion of the abolition of slavery in American history as taught in American primary schools. It's a way of looking at history that definitely has heroes and villains, angels and demons, and invites us to imagine that we, as vegan activists, can play a role in the next chapter of the world's history that is tantamount to, that is comparable to, the role of abolitionists who fought against slavery in America's history. And there's rarely emphasis put on the Civil War. It's rarely phrased in terms of inviting us to fight in a civil war that's going to kill enormous numbers of people. So it's a somewhat selective rereading of that history. But nevertheless, my point here just in starting is the American origins and the American format, so to speak, of abolitionism is obvious even in the name. I'd also say that part of the appeal of abolitionism just comes from the name itself. So that name is really loaded with emotional significance for Americans. It's tied to their history. And ultimately, I think vegans who they wanted something catchy and something that immediately summons up images not only of radicalism, but of epoch-making, world-changing radicalism in a way that a tag like ethical vegan doesn't. Ethical vegan could be associated with a retreat, with withdrawing from society, with living like a Buddhist monk, separating yourself from society. You could be an ethical vegan and live in a cave. But an abolitionist vegan, already the word summons up this issue of trying to transform the society you live in, especially the transformation of the United States, just as the abolition of slavery did. Again, don't mention the Civil War. Part of the reason why that transformation was so dramatic was precisely the Civil War. Now, abolitionism, it did also, especially, to mention just two varieties, because today there are different leaders in the abolitionist vegan movement, or movements, plural, and they do debate with one another, they do disagree with one another vociferously. But, for example, Gary Francione is one famous leader in that, and Wayne Seong, the founder of Direct Action Everywhere, is another. They have taken that concept in different directions, and as mentioned, they engage in, I guess you could say, healthy intellectual debates. Now, there's an old idiom in English of a dancing bear, not a very vegan image. When a bear gets on stage and dances, you're not asking the audience whether or not the bear is dancing well. The audience is expected to applaud because the bear is dancing at all. We have to be honest. The caliber of intellectual debate within veganism is so low that, as with the dancing bear, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the quality of the debate surrounding abolitionism is poor. The fact that there is an intellectual debate at all, the fact that there are multiple philosophies debating the future of, veganism as a political movement, like the dancing bear, we applaud just because there is any such performance at all. And I mean that, believe it or not, as a sincere compliment in a way. Even though I disagree a great deal with people like Gary Francione and Wayne Seong, even though in many ways their work seems to me astoundingly stupid, to be blunt, I can realize, it's completely obvious to me that these are people who have good intentions, and they're piously, in their own way, trying to save the planet. No more, no less. All right, with all that having been said, what is the philosophical problem at the root of the abolitionist approach? Philosophically, and I'm emphasizing the word philosophically because when we're talking about philosophy, we're not talking about methods of effective activism. So the way that Direct Action Everywhere organizes a public protest That's a question of effective activism. I already have many videos addressed to that. Philosophically, I think the error they're engaged in is refusing to admit of a difference between prescriptive ethics and descriptive ethics. So they are refusing to admit of a difference between statements about what you ought to do and analytical statements about trying to understand what the situation really is. Analytical statements involve shades of gray. They involve statements about what's comparatively better and comparatively worse, sometimes purely hypothetical, sometimes actual, sometimes dealing with historical examples. So, for example, we could have a conference where we compare North Korea to Iraq. Let's say that conference, let's say we had a bunch of historians, academics, political scientists, different political figures, come to a conference back in the year 2000 talking about the dictatorship in Iraq at that time and the dictatorship in North Korea. The abolitionist vegan position would be outraged by this. Of course, this is a comparison. And say, how dare you draw up an analysis where you talk about which is better and worse? How dare you deal with these shades of gray, these complex contradictions? You only can respond to this by taking an abolitionist position of saying, no, all dictatorship has to end. Now, let's say at this conference, not only do they compare North Korea and Iraq, but they talk about the whole range of possible interventions. They talk about ways to ameliorate human rights conditions, right? And now, as we know, in the years after 2000, there have been unending wars in Iraq. And, one of the reasons why in political science we talk about halfway measures is precisely to avoid war. It's very easy to come to the conclusion, as George W. Bush did, that the way to abolish a dictatorship is to drop bombs on it. And if you're over the age of 20, you probably now have some memory of how that's gone in the last 10 plus years. Wow, we're way past 10 years on that now, aren't we? Anyway, so again, the abolitionist position is refusing to admit not only the shades of gray analytically, but that in terms of prescriptive ethics, we get into statements about what you should do that, again, are morally loaded and complex. Yes, it's very easy for me to say everyone should stop eating meat. It's very easy for me to say that Iraq should cease to be a dictatorship or should become a democracy. It's easy for me to say that about North Korea also. But to wade into the complex analytical and prescriptive details of what we can actually do brings us into murky shades of gray. And that's what we do in politics. That's what we do in political science, from the alpha to the omega, from page 1 to the last page of the book, folks. Philosophy is something separate from political science. But philosophically, we can't disable ourselves. We can't prevent ourselves from being able to deal with all those rich shades of gray. So in terms of illustrating this, because I'm talking about the principle thing, but now I'm going to get into the particular just enough so you can understand my point. If you want to help a particular population of dolphins, this is my favorite example, I have used it before, the abolitionists would actually object to this because you're breaking a number of their sacred rules, a number of their pious precepts. How can you help just dolphins? That's speciesism. You're supposed to treat dolphins as equal to mosquitoes. You're supposed to treat dolphins as equal to cows and foxes and everything else. They object to any single issue cause. So if I set up a charity as a vegan and I say, yeah, you know what? I care about cows, I care about pigs, but I especially care about this particular population of dolphins in this particular river. In Southeast Asia, we have dolphins that live in rivers. I know the more famous dolphins live in the ocean. There are also river dolphins. I want to prevent this population of dolphins from going extinct. I want to deal with this issue. This matters to me. Yes, it's a single issue cause. No, it's not going to abolish the meat and dairy industry. No, it's not going to convince the world to give up wearing leather and to instead wear synthetic fabrics or what have you. It's not going to address any of those issues. But I care about these dolphins now. And if somebody doesn't do something now or in the next 10 years, they're going to go extinct. Now, of course, it could be dolphins. It could be monkeys. You can pick any example. But the reality of activism in the real world does involve those kinds of compromises. It does involve rolling up your sleeves and engaging in some single issue causes. And otherwise, the consequences are absolutely terrible. So if these concepts they're employing, whether it's the anti-speciesist notion, which is useful within some limits, so I do think it's useful. You guys have probably seen the t-shirts that say, why do you love one and kill the other? And it compares a dog to a pig. I completely agree. I think that dogs and pigs and wolves and lions, it is very useful philosophically to be able to point out to people the differences we create between them ethically are counterproductive. Fine. However, if you're in the abolitionist paradigm, the next step is for you to claim that we cannot engage in any single issue activity. Then it means we can't help lions and we can't help dolphins and we can't help dogs either. Right? So this is a moral position that has gone past the point of diminishing returns and has become absurd and counterproductive. Now, again, why is that? I think the fundamental philosophical error is failing to deal with the nature of prescriptive ethics, statements about what you should do, as opposed to descriptive and analytical ethics. So this video is now 11 minutes long. I just point out I have only talked about this fundamental philosophical issue. There's then a kind of magical bridge from how you get from this concept of the abolitionist refusal to engage in single issue causes, the notion that we should only focus on the end of the industry. How do you cross the bridge from that to the specific model of activism that Direct Action Everywhere engages in, that involves some ridiculous forms of protest, such as running from the crowd of a baseball stadium onto the field? I can give you a clip of them doing exactly that. Their method of disruption, of jumping over the barrier and trying to interrupt Bernie Sanders when he's speaking. There is no logical dotted line that connects their philosophy to their pragmatic ideas about effective activism. Now, admittedly, that's a separate critique, a separate set of questions. You could have a totally different philosophy and still believe in those methods, and there already have been videos on this channel debating that. Abolitionism, I really do think most of its public profile comes from the name itself, and comes to the fact that so many vegans feel lonely and powerless, and they want an ideology that makes them feel like they're part of a massive movement that's challenging society fundamentally in the same way that the abolition of slavery did. But, it might be more humble and effective if we coined some totally new term like disassemblism. I checked Google, no other political ideology has used that, disassemblism, and we admitted, you know what, even though we care about circuses, even though we care about zoos, even though we care about the use of animals in vivisection and cancer research, we have to recognize the overweening importance of disassembling the meat and milk and leather industry that currently stands at the core of our society, at the core of our economy, at the core of our culture in some ways. And that it's an enormous task in the next 100 years. It's a task of such tragic enormity that even if we focus all of our efforts on it, I don't know how much we could accomplish in the next 50 years, say, right? And that many of these other issues, although I do think they're worth debating, I do think they're worth understanding. I think it's worth, and I have several hours discussing just zoos on this channel. I have a great video with Jay Costley on that and so on. Someone who used to be an employee in zoos and who knows behind the scenes of the work. I do think those ethical issues are interesting and illuminating, and they're of philosophical significance. But pragmatically and politically, if we started from acknowledging just one goal of that kind, if we were looking at actually abolishing industrialized meat production in the next 100 years, at the same time we would recognize, you know what? Dealing with hunters is not our priority. Dealing with seal hunters in the Arctic Circle of Canada is not our priority. It doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean I'm a speciesist. It doesn't mean I love cows and hate seals. It doesn't mean any of those things. But it means, okay, with all due humility, we have to set these sort of priorities. And I think that more humble and pragmatic approach, whether or not it has a fancy term like disassemblism attached to it, that's the approach that lets you recognize, if I want to save these dolphins in this river, here's what I have to do. And it may involve all kinds of moral compromises. It may involve cooperating with fishermen. It may involve cooperating with hunters. It may involve cooperating with all kinds of non-vegans, but who agree with you, who are united with you, who stand together with you and support you on that one issue of helping those dolphins.